verses, and John on history. John was directed on history. Anyway, that's all right. I'm not an historian.
Yes, so you can finish that one.
Am I on? Really?
Yes.
Can you hear me out there?
Yes.
All right, this is something very, very new for me. I started teaching at the University of Kansas 71 years ago, and this is the very first time I've ever, I think, sat down instead of standing up, talking on this subject that I'm talking on. All sorts of things are brand new, so please, please. I think this has been announced as a history of the family. It's really not. It's sort of more reminiscences. I wouldn't dare say I will preach history because that's when John would just clobber me probably. So anyway, I'm pretty old, you see. I'm soon 91, and I'm probably the only one, except Mary Lynn up to a certain extent, who really, really knew our grandparents, some of your great-grandparents, some of your great-great-grandparents, and probably more than she, I talked to them a lot. And so a lot of what I have to say here, I didn't get out of, certainly didn't get out of a book or anything else. I just got it from them. I'm not going to say anything about the Farwell Brown family, though I will say this. I knew Russ Farwell before anybody here, and probably before anybody, most of you were even born. Russ Farwell was 20 years old, I think. I was 13. He was a new Christian, and he arrived in Kansas City from California with Johnny Staley to work at the North American Aircraft Factory. This was before the Marines or anything like that. Well, he came in with Johnny, and I was staying with the Staley family up in Kansas City. They were very, very good friends of mine. And here came Johnny Staley and Russ Farwell, and they and I and 3 other Staley boys all slept in the same great big room up in the attic. And that is where I met Russ. Shortly after that, I was baptized at Truce Avenue Gospel Hall, and we had a young people's meeting at the Sheldrake House, and Russ was the first person to rush up and congratulate me on my baptism. I can still remember that perfectly. I remember some other things too, including one time he really corrected me for something he thought I had done wrong. And he was right, and I was wrong, and I still remember having to admit to him, you're right and I'm wrong. Of course, all of this, almost all of this, was long before I ever knew that he would be related to me as my brother-in-law. And so that's Russ Farwell. My time with him goes way, way back. Now, as to the other side, there's some of you here of the Thomas Bradford bunch. Of course, I knew them way back. Florence. The idea was always, you know, as we grew up, I knew Florence from the time she was 5 and Charlotte from the time she was 6 years old. The idea as we all grew up was always, I think it was never written or expressed exactly. It was sort of that I was going to marry Charlotte and Jim was going to marry, my brother Jim was going to marry Florence. It turned out my brother Jim married Charlotte, and I didn't marry either one of them. However, and I hope to go see Florence now in Hutchinson, where my grandson is studying, and maybe renew a bit of the acquaintance. I think actually one of the reasons they went to Peru, other than the Lord's leading, they went to Peru 10 years after we went to Peru, and we helped them get get settled there and so forth. And I think very likely it's because we'd grown up. I knew Gordon before Gordon knew Florence. I think they were both. I remember very well when Gordon became a Christian. I still remember his realizing what Christ is Lord meant, because he had thought he was going to be a Methodist preacher. And he became a Christian, and I think it was the first day he said, I can't decide what I'm going to be. God, just like that. So he's sort of like my wife, you know, he's right bang. He learned things that some of us took a lot longer to learn. Anyway, I, of course, never knew the Thomases. Will Thomas died. Charlotte and Florence don't remember Will Thomas either. But I do remember the person that came over from Wales and preached with him and sang with him and so forth, David Lawrence. And I saw him when he was up there 100 years old, up in Iowa. And I still remember talking to him about things. The Bradford side I knew very well. Very well. I'd just go down to Perry, Kansas, and I would spend the days there. Florence taught me how to milk a cow. And I can still remember Florence sitting there and shooting the milk straight into the cat's mouth. Boy, I thought that was really something. And more or less with time, I could get a little bit of milk out of the cow too. Anyway, the Bradford side, and I remember the grandparents and the brothers and sisters of Margaret Thomas and all the rest. To everybody else in the family, she was Aunt Margaret. I was always very formal. She was always Mrs. Thomas to me, even though we'd grown up. But anyway, we were very, very good friends of the Bradfords and of Aunt Margaret Thomas. So that's about all I've got to say about that side, because I was never related to any of them until Mary Lynn married Russ, and then he became my brother-in-law. And so that's when I came into the family. All right, so I want to talk now about the ones that most of us probably here are sort of descendants from. On the one side, there's the Sommerville Baker family, and on the other side, there's the Aldergott Alsman side. I'm going to talk about the Aldergott Alsman side first, because I think most of you know more about C.J. Baker and maybe about Baker and Lockwood and all of these things. And I'm probably the last person in the family that ever worked in the canvas business, not for Baker and Lockwood, but for an offshoot of Baker and Lockwood. Matter of fact, I was working there at the time that the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. But to me, it was a great relief, because 6 months later I was going to be in the Army and probably in the invasion of Japan, in which case I wouldn't have been here to give you this talk at all. And the other thing was, well, I think it was a Wednesday maybe, and I thought, well, that ends the contract to make Army tents. And sure enough, we went back to work and said, we're not going to make any more Army tents. Well, 5 years later, I was in the Korean War, and I'm sure I must have slept in some of the tents that I helped make, because it was only 5 years later. Okay, well, that's sort of an introduction. Now let's go to this is my mother's family. My mother, of course, was Catherine Marie Aldergott. And I'll tell you in a minute why so many people were named Catherine in that family. Matter of fact, she was named Catherine Marie because her father's mother was named Catherine Marie also. She was always called Marie, but her name was Catherine Marie. Okay. My grandfather Aldergott, his wife was Meisingen, was born in Russia. He was born in a town called Denhof, which was a German-speaking town. I'll tell you in a minute why it was German-speaking. When he was 9 years old, he went to a bigger city, I think to live with an uncle, and that was a city which is still important in Russia called Saratov. And Saratov is on the Volga River. Catherine the Great, I have to give you a little bit of history here.
Not much.
Huh? Pardon?
Okay, move it.
Move what?
You're doing fine.
I'm supposed to move something. See, I knew I was going to be corrected right at the... I've already got through the preamble. Anyway, here we go. During the later part of the 18th century, they were looking for somebody to marry the next Tsar of Russia. Of course, royalty and nobility in those days did not look outside to commoners or even to the elite commoners. It had to be somebody of royalty or at least nobility. And there was nobody in Russia, I guess, and so they went to Germany and found a young princess. I think she was 15 years old when she was taken to Russia to marry the upcoming Tsar of Russia. Well, he became Tsar of Russia when his father died, but he was mentally retarded and so forth, and it didn't work, so they got rid of him and assassinated him soon after. But she, this new wife, she wasn't quite so new then and so forth, but this German princess, she had become very Russianized. She had learned the language, she had converted from the Lutheran faith to the Russian Orthodox faith and so forth, and she took over, and she became Catherine the Great, one of the great monarchs of Russia. Well, one of the things she wanted to do, having come from Germany, she knew that Russia was way behind. And so she wanted to bring people in to sort of modernize it. And being from Germany, she thought of Germany, and that's when she brought them in. From different parts of Germany, some were Catholic, some were Lutheran, some were Mennonites. And she brought them in, and they had many privileges there. And the boys didn't do military service. They had their own courts, they had their own laws, they could have their own religion, and so forth and so on. And that went on. And that's where my grandfather, Aldergott, was born, in a town called Den Haag, named after a German nobleman. And then he went to live with his uncle, as I say, in Sarato. A century passed, however, and those privileges were mostly taken away. And so, many of them decided to emigrate, including the Aldergotts. My grandfather's brother had already come over and settled in Kansas City. He was a tailor, and my grandfather, Aldergott, came over and settled there and came to Kansas City to work also in tailoring. And that's what he did all his life. I think he retired when he was 75 years old or something like that. But he worked with his brother in a tailor shop. Now, when he arrived in the United States, he spoke German and he spoke Russian, and I know he studied Latin. He spoke not one word, so far as I know, of English. He told me, he said, I would learn this way. He says, I took a dime, 10 cents, and I held it up and I said, "Oni dime." They say, no, it's one dime. Oh, it's not oni dime, it's one dime. So he says, that's the way. And when I was small, I talked a great deal to him. I never remembered, I knew he was a foreigner, but I never thought of an accent. Later, I asked my Aunt Jean, I said, what did they think of Grandpa's accent? She says, my school friends thought it was cute. Well, I don't even remember thinking it was cute and so on. He learned the English language very well. I heard him preach in the English language. Also doing John 3:16, I remember both in German and in Russian. But I remember about it, and especially was sitting in his house and reading the Bible. He would come home and he would sit there. He read it. I think very often it was Luther's translation in German. Sometimes, however, he read it in Russian. Sometimes he read it in English. And he would sit there and he would read it. And sometimes, and I still remember this, I remember it emotionally, he would say, David, listen to this. And he would read something, and then he would explain it. And I still remember to this day, I hope that someday I too will, excuse me, I'm sorry, someday I too will be able to know something about the
Here, honey.
I don't know, help me, about the Bible like Grandpa does. He was converted. I'm not sure if it was under the influence of C.J. Baker or not, because he wasn't converted when he came to the United States, but he became converted very soon after that. Now, his brother never converted so far as I remember. I remember very well his brother, Uncle Fred, and his wife, Aunt Fanny. She was German speaking, so they spoke German at home, and so their children, my mother's cousins, spoke German. My mother never did. Well, she studied later, because she married a non-German speaking wife. But anyway, he started working with his brother in the tailor shop. And they were, I think, the best-known tailor shop in Kansas City. They catered to all of the bankers and the politicians. Matter of fact, I once read that where Harry Truman worked making hats before he went into politics. Thank you. Making hats over in Independence, and they were making suits in Kansas City, and they were going together there. The Truman was making hats, and the Aldergotts were making suits.
Yes.
And I thought from you that he got saved reading the Bible in the boarding house.
It could very well be. I do not
The boarding
know.
house with Mr. Sommerville. That's what I thought.
All right, very good. Thank you.
I may be wrong.
No, and you very possibly are right. I really don't know.
Repeat it for everybody.
Huh?
Repeat that for everybody.
She heard that he became a Christian living in a boarding house where
They read the Bible every night.
they read the Bible every night, and that's very, because I don't really have any historical knowledge of this. I do know that he came under the influence definitely of C.J. Baker, and I remember us talking very well about C.J. Baker. Well, I'll come to that when I come to the Sommerville side. Constant, faithful believer. He went to the Union Station, which is now a museum, you know, that First World War, something that was a train station in those days. And every Sunday he went there, and every Sunday to give out tracts. And I don't mean he just scattered tracts. He talked to the person as he gave them tracts. He liked to do that, and somebody said, I'll provide you all the tracts you want if you will give them out. And he gave out in his life over 1 million tracts, which means he talked to 1 million people and gave them out. And I know he made friends. I still remember one friend, a Christian friend who was a Catholic priest. I remember, and he told me something about that. Anyway, I won't go into that story. This will go on forever. But he made friends that way. Also, the one thing, he had a lot of Jewish friends. Of course, being a tailor shop, the best known in Kansas City, making for all the higher ups, an awful lot of them, of course, were Jewish bankers and of course, he being German speaking, and they being Yiddish, and Yiddish is a dialect of German, of course they could communicate. And I still remember in the house, every year there were calendars up there, Jewish calendars, and and so forth. And so he had and there's one thing I'm very happy about. On both sides of my family, we grew up without discrimination. There was no discrimination against Jews, so far as I can remember, and there was certainly no discrimination against blacks either. I remember sitting in Lawrence, Kansas in 1829 Barker, sitting there with 2 or 3 black Afro-Americans, people sitting there and so forth, and people would go walk by and sort of look like this, and that didn't bother Dad. Didn't bother Mother, and I'm very glad we grew up in a situation in which I never felt any of that, and certainly I never felt any from parents or grandparents. Grandpa lived, probably a lot more things I can tell you. I don't. Anyway. I do remember one other thing that was interesting. During the 1930s, of course, there was no television and anything like this. But we did have radio, and I remember listening to some of Adolf Hitler's speeches. Adolf Hitler would be blasting out from the radio. Grandpa would be sitting there and telling us what he said. There was no translation, there were no subtitles on radio, but he would tell us what Adolf Hitler was saying. I still remember that too. Yeah. He died as I think he would have liked to die, in the Lord's Supper. He keeled over. He was in the Lord's Supper, and he had spoken, I believe, and then he says, let's sing number. And for years, I didn't think he had given out the number. Then one day I was talking to Ray Jones. Some of you knew Ray Jones down in Baldwin City. Ray Jones said, no. He says, I've got written right in my hymn book or in my Bible. But he gave, because he says, I was the one that ran up to him and took care of him when he keeled over. Ray Jones at that time was studying medicine. He wasn't a doctor yet. And then later I said something about this in Baldwin City, and Ray Jones' son, I suppose it was David, I remember, said, yeah, he says, I helped him. I helped him get your grandfather up. So anyway, he continued very faithfully as a Christian till he died, and he died in, well, he wasn't quite as old as I am, I think, but I think he was 86, 87, something like that.
Tell us the hymn.
Which was the hymn?
I don't know it. Mary Lynn probably has.
Mary knows.
Number 3, yes. We were looking at it the other day. It has a melody that we had never heard before. So we wonder if they could have sung up to How Sweet the Name of Jesus Sounds.
But it wasn't those words.
But,
No.
but the hymn is, "'Tis past this dark and fearsome night, and Lord, we hail thee now."
And then he died.
And then he died. And the rest of the hymn, we were looking at it, it's about 6 verses. It's actually 300 or 304 in the Black Believer symbol, which you've got probably here. Anyway, and the rest of the verses are about the Lord's death and then resurrection. But I thought it'd make a great funeral hymn, so I'm going to have. So Nathan Asbury, who's going to lead the singing at my funeral, is going to lead that. The tune of How Sweet the Name of Jesus Sounds. So you could all come and hear it.
Not for a few years.
Looking forward to it.
When I die, I'll come up here for my funeral and you can sing it in English instead of Spanish. And you can sing it there too. Okay, very good.
Well, anyway, I don't know the name. I can't say. Oh, yeah, I will say this. He had 7 children, 6 girls and 1 boy. And I knew all of them, and I knew all and so forth. Some I have very good memories of, some I don't have such good memories of. Anyway, my mother was number 1. And my Aunt Jean at the age, and way down, died too many years ago. I visited her in Texas. She was the last, or was Aunt Ruth the last? No, I think Aunt Jean was the last, and she was up in her 80s too. And
She was actually 90-something.
oh yeah, she was 93 or 94, I think, something like that. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, that's all I'll say about Grandpa. To me, he was a very great person. I spent a lot of time with him. We lived in Lawrence. Of course, I grew up in Kansas City until I was 7 years old. I started my school in Kansas City and then came to Quarterly School in Lawrence. I think I'm in Lawrence right now, but of course I'm not. Anyway, and so, but we spent a lot of time with all the grandparents
Okay,
because,
one thing about Grandpa.
yeah,
One last thing. He was such a gentleman. He had these
impeccably
classy suits on. I'm sure Nancy remembers him and probably Susan. But but the thing was, when he retired at 75, it was the first time he had ever not worn a shirt and tie for that day. He sat on his front porch up on that terrace at
2832 East
11. You can go find it. And he said, "Look at my sports shirt." It was a red plaid one. He was so proud of it. But if you had a coat, if you had something on, he would
come and feel it.
oh yeah, he would pinch you and say, "Oh, that's a nice background."
But he was a gentleman.
And
And one more thing. When he would get up to speak during the war, he was known for, he would speak about the Lord, and then he would finish by saying, "Who was a Jew," and sat down. There was a lot of anti-Jewish feeling at that time. Can you take my picture doing that? Oh, good.
It's all on video.
And you can still see the house that they had built for them, and with a very steep terrace. And I still remember mowing that terrace. How in the world I did it, I do not
But she
know.
walked down the day he died.
What?
But she walked down those.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. And the house is still there.
One of the first with electricity, electric lights.
But actually, it was gas things that were in there, and then it was made for gas lighting, and then they put in the electricity.
So people would come over and do the buttons, turn on the lights for fun.
Yeah, exactly. Well, as a matter of fact, I've still got 3 families to go, so I better get ahead. Haven't I? Anyway, that's the older house, but it was to me a very interesting thing. And the other thing, he always carried sensen in his pocket. I found later sensen for people who smoke, but he did. But he'd always give us a little bit of sensen. I can still taste it right now. I can taste the sensen.
But in remembrance meeting, if I sat by him in remembrance meeting, which lasted for an hour and a half in that meeting, he would, midway through, he would reach in his pocket and give me a lifesaver. And I would wait all whole time for that one. That's why I give out lemon drops. Go ahead.
So in other words, family heritage just keeps going down. It changes what you're sucking. But anyway, okay.
All right, now he married a woman named
What's her name?
Edith
Edith.
Alsman.
Edith Edna Alsman. All right, now I'll tell you something about Edith Edna Alsman. Oh, here's one interesting thing, though, too. She married Grandpa Aldergott. He was a Russian citizen. She was born in Junction City, Kansas, and traveled by covered wagon from Junction City down to Oklahoma to settle in Oklahoma. And so she was an American. In those days, if American citizen married, American woman citizen married a foreigner, she lost her American citizenship and took on the citizenship of her husband. That was true in Argentina too, I know at that time. So they got married. She became then a Russian citizen. But then Grandpa Aldergott naturalized to America. So here was the American born in Russia married to the Russian born in Junction City, Kansas. So she had to become naturalized to become an American. Well, that was another part of the thing. Anyway, the Alsmans were a family from way back. As a matter of fact, they came over in the 1770s, before the Revolutionary War. Their name was Saltzman, but they changed it, like so many people did. Saltzman, they changed to Alsman. And the one who came over, I think, or the son of them, I'm not sure, was I haven't, it's all out, but I haven't put it together yet. Anyway, Jacob Saltzman became Jacob Alsman. He died at 111 years old. Now I tell my children sometimes that Grandma, my mother, I can't keep track of generation. My mother died at 100. Her sister almost 102. This ancestor 111, and my children tremble. But they may just keep trembling for a while. I mean, I used to say this is my last visit to the States, but I said that several trips ago. So one never knows. That's what the Lord will decide that. Anyway, the Alsmans were an old family, and exactly what they did all that time, I don't know. I do know a couple of three things though. I know that my grandmother's father was in the Civil War. He was with an Illinois regiment. I understand he was at the Battle of Gettysburg, though I think he maybe was reserve. I don't know, but he was evidently at the Gettysburg. And he's buried, interestingly enough, in a military cemetery in California. And I still have the plot. I know exactly the plot. I have the map and so forth where he is buried in California. I think he must have gone out there because some of his sons, some of my grandmother's brothers went out there. I know she had a brother named Samuel, and she was so pleased when we named our son Samuel because it was her favorite brother. And I think he had gone out there to live with some of that family, and that's where he died in California. I should have said too, first, about my grandfather Aldergott. His name was Johann Jakob. Johann Jakob Sommerville.
No.
He was always known, He was always known as Jacob Aldergott, I'm sorry, Johann Jakob Aldergott. He was always known as Jacob and generally Jake Sommerville is what I remember it being called, at least by his contemporaries. Unfortunately, my brother Tim always calls him Jake, and I think that's, well, I don't think that's quite enough reverence, but anyway. And the Alsman, the other thing I understand, and I don't know about, in somewhere, the mother was Hooker. It was an Alsman married to a Hooker. And I know that was related to General Fighting Joe Hooker, who for a while was the commander-in-chief of the Union Army until he lost to Lee and Jackson at the Battle of Chancellorsville. But he continued as a general in the Northern Army, and he was chosen by the Secretary of the Army to organize and preside at Abraham Lincoln's funeral in Springfield, Illinois. So that was, my Aunt Jean said it's in her obituary that he was my grandmother's uncle. Now, John, who is an historian, questions that, and I question it too, and I haven't only that. But there was some kind of a relationship there. Incidentally, let me correct something too. Hookers, as prostitutes, it was not named after General Hooker. As a matter of fact, the term had been used in England even before that, and in the United States before that. And so I just want to correct that. Though he was, from my read, not a very moral man. But anyway, certainly not with his troops and all the rest.
He became governor of New York State.
Became governor of New York. So anybody who's in
Just
that
keep
family
on,
is
keep
related somehow to a governor of New York. Isn't that something? So, great. Okay. Now,
Is that a plus?
anyway, they got married, and actually my grandmother, Alsman, I think was working at Baker and Lockwood, sewing tents. Of course, half the people at Baker Lockwood, and up to CJ, if we're up to CJ Baker, all the people at Baker Lockwood would have been in Troost Avenue Gospel Hall, and a great number of them were. And I think that's, I don't know, I suppose that's where they met, because when Grandpa Alder became a Christian, somehow, I don't know the history of this, I don't know if anybody does, came into the Troost Avenue Gospel Hall.
That's where I got the impression that Mr. Somerville was in this same boarding house.
Well,
I could be wrong.
Well, I think it's very likely. And when I come to the Somervilles, we'll say something more about this too, about the Scottish background and all the rest. At any rate, they married. They had, as I say, 7 children. Mother was the first, and Aunt Ruth was the second, and Aunt Alice was the third. I'll just say something about Aunt Alice. Aunt Alice married a person named Forrest Gill. Forrest Gill had, I think, the most important silk screen processing thing in the world. He sent out signs to every place and so on. I remember when he started in the basement of his house. I still remember being down there. I understand he learned it from my dad, how to do it, and so forth. And he is the person, you can find this on the internet, he's the person that invented the bumper sticker. Bumper stickers you see every day were invented by my Uncle Forrest. And he married, Alice Aldegar. And it went on down. The other person who is unfortunately famous is a cousin of ours. She was the son of the last of the 7, who was Jean McKnight. She was an artist, and her son is Tom McKnight. Get on the internet if you want to. You can find he's become a multimillionaire. I was sitting once in a McDonald's. It was either in Córdoba or in Buenos Aires in Argentina. I looked up and they had a bunch of pictures around the wall. I looked at a distance and I thought, that looks like Tom's. I went up and sure there was Tom McKnight across the bottom.
We found him in Taiwan.
Taiwan, all right, they found him in Taiwan.
In
Yeah.
a McDonald's.
Well,
Yeah. And Burger King in
He's
Chicago.
all over the
He
place.
married a very good press agent.
He painted and he married
He
somebody.
would never have done anything without her.
But you know, to my Aunt Ruth, another of my mother's sisters, the one after her, I was in their home in Stony Brook, New York once, and she had a bunch of his pictures around the wall. I looked and I said, "Who painted those?" She says, "Tom painted them." I said, "That's not his style." And I said to my Aunt Jean once, "I don't like Tom's style very well." She says, "I don't think he does either. But he sure knew what sold." I don't know if he liked it or not, but anyway, some people like it, so that's all right. So she was born in Junction City. They traveled down to Oklahoma in a covered wagon. Everything between there and getting to Kansas City, frankly, I do not know. When she was very old, the old folks home, and I took my kids to see her, she told them stories about the Indians and some bandit that came through and wanted a dinner or something or other, and they sent him on his way then, and I don't know.
He
But
gave him 50 cents.
50, is
The
that it?
bandits gave them 50 cents.
The bandits gave 50 cents.
That was a lot.
That was a lot of money in those days. Sure. Of course, they probably had gotten it free anyway, so it didn't matter. But she was a very interesting person and told me all sorts of stories and
She
so
taught
forth.
me to knit when I was 6. Hence the hats.
Heritage goes way back. Of
course, she's just a kid compared to me, but still she's getting on the age. Long time. Okay, anyway, that's probably better as far as I ought to go with that side of the family. Okay, the Sommervilles, of course, are from Scotland. They're from the lowlands of Scotland. The Sommerville name, of course, comes originally from Normandy, France. It's sometimes spelled with two M's, sometimes one M, sometimes one O, sometimes O, sometimes a U, and so forth. Shakespeare himself spelled his own name, I think, in 5 or 6 different ways. There were no dictionaries, you just spelled it however it sounded. We still have that problem in Spanish sometimes, but at least we don't have so many spelling errors as you do in the United States. So anyway, they came over from Lanarkshire, from a town called Wisham, which is near Motherwell, which is between Glasgow and Edinburgh, closer to Glasgow. They were coal miners. They came over to the United States and worked, I guess, in coal mines. I don't know, do you know whether it was Pennsylvania or West Virginia? Or
West Virginia.
West Virginia, was it? Anyway, and they were coal miners. And then somebody said to my great-grandfather, there are jobs in the coal mines in Iowa. In those days, Iowa was a coal mining state. And then somebody said, but Willie, there are no assemblies in Iowa. Well, we'll go make some. And that's exactly what they did. And when I came back from Peru the very first time in 1960, I went up to southern Iowa, Centerville, and some of these places, and I had people tell, oh yes, I remember your grandfather, I remember your great-grandfather, so they were still around. And my father told me, and I saw this printed too, William Sommerville, that would be my great-grandfather, was not a preacher, but my father told me he was an excellent pastor. He said, when I grew up, he meant more to me in my spiritual life than anybody, including C.J. Baker, I guess, and so forth. He said he taught me so many things, and he was, I guess, a very great pastor. Anyway, they said they were up in Iowa, and then exactly how it got down to Kansas. Anyway, I'm not going into the history of the thing, but my grandfather, who married my Aunt Granny, that would be C.J. Baker's daughter. We'll come to that in a minute. But anyway, how did I start that sentence?
Your grandfather, Sommerville.
Yeah, anyway, okay. My grandfather Sommerville was, at 7 years old, was working in a coal mine. I understand he was working up on a certain...
This is your great-grandfather.
No, I'm talking about my grandfather now, I think, was working up on the surface, and he was communicating something down to the
That's
people.
your great-grandfather. Your grandfather came over.
That's right, and he was 7 years old when he was doing this.
You're saying he did it in the United States.
That's what exactly.
Okay, go ahead.
He came over when he was 7 years old.
Yeah.
And that's when he was, as a child, he was working up at the top of the mines and radioing down and telling them if there was gas coming or something like that. Yeah, no, that was our grandfather.
It was in the States.
Yeah.
Our great-grandfather came over, he was an adult, of course. As a matter of fact, he came over with 3 and maybe 4 children. I'm not sure. Well, let me go back to Scotland for just a minute. He came from Lanarkshire, and he was a coal miner. The only person I know who is famous of that family, and I don't know if he's a cousin or what relative, was Sir Harry Lauder. Now, Sir Harry Lauder was at one time the best known and the highest paid entertainer in the world. He traveled all over. He wrote words and music for hundreds of hymns. You can find them you can find him singing them too, and so forth on the internet. He was named Sir Harry Lauder for all he had done for the troops during the First World War, and his son was killed in the First World War. At any rate, I know he knew my grandfather. I don't know if they were cousins or what, because my grandfather was back in Scotland. I still remember the story of my grandfather asking him, but Harry, doesn't this get boring? because he traveled all over the world. The United States, he was very popular. He is a very good friend of Charlie Chaplin, for example. As a matter of fact, I got something on the internet that he and Charlie Chaplin are doing something together. And but he told my grandfather, "Oh, but Willie, the money." But he had also started out as a coal miner. He's also from Lanarkshire. Churchill, Winston Churchill, said he is the best ambassador that Scotland ever had. And he was very, and so forth. But anyway, that's the only person famous that I know of that side of the family. Later on, I don't know all of the ins and outs, but later on, of course, well, our grandfather only got through 3rd grade. But in those days, you could go ahead on your own, and he became a mining engineer. And he was very well known, I guess, as a mining engineer because he sent at least once, and I'm not sure if not more than once, as a representative of the United States government to Europe for conferences of mining engineers. And as a matter of fact, the United States government gave him a big gold watch with WCS engraved on the back, which I then passed on to my son Pepe, and then it's now passed on to Ethan, who is my, well, oh, to
Philip.
It went to Pepe.
To Philip.
It's now, Philip's got it now, yeah. WCS. Oh, let me say another thing. If you say William Sommerville, of course, you don't know who you're talking about. My great-grandson is William. My grandson is William. My son is William. I'm William. My father was William. His father was William. His father was William. And I think...
And you're sitting next to William Williams.
He just married in.
No, he didn't.
I know what his name is, William
I
Williams.
mean, what were they thinking?
I know his name.
Go on with you.
So we pass it even to those who did come in through the back door. because
Sonny's hand is getting
the tradition in Scotland is that the oldest son inherits the father's name. Well, of course, back in there it was just William. My grandfather was just William, but he decided he wanted another name, so he put Charles in. So he became William Charles. Dad was William Baker. I'm William David. My son was William Joseph. We always use the other name. I think they called me David because, not to confuse me with my dad, because he was always Bill Sommerville. His father, though, was not Bill. He was Willie. And as a matter of fact, Pepe, when he was in school, sometimes they called him Willie because they see his name. And there are more people now in Argentina, I think, that know me as Guillermo, which is Spanish, than know me as David. Probably because they see my name and I'm William David, and they just take the first name and be done. Okay. He became president of Baker and Lockwood. And he died as president of Baker and Lockwood. He was 58 or 59 years old when he died. The first memory I have of anything is when I was 3 years old, going into his room where he was lying in bed. It was just before he died. Matter of fact, he died just before Mary Lynn was born. She was born in October. He died, I think, in September. And I must have seen him in July or August. And I remember seeing him in bed in his house. So that's my very, very first memory. Now we'll go to the Baker family. The Baker family seems to have got the most fame.
Had the most money.
Had the most money. Well, there are a number of reasons, so forth. However, when I look back, you know, my father said, my father had two grandfathers, C.J. Baker and Somerville. And my father always told me the greatest influence I had in my Christian life as I grew up was my grandfather Somerville, he said. I remember that. He's the one that pastored me and so forth. Anyway, so C.J. Baker came over from the other end of the United Kingdom. He came from Sussex, from Hailsham. Hailsham is very close to where the Duke of Normandy took over, killing King Harold, the last of the Saxon kings, and took over and so forth. And he brought over with him Sommervilles from Normandy, the Vikings who had settled there and so on. Anyway, okay, yeah, we're on the baker. He came from Sussex and so forth. Evidently, this is a story I've heard. His family seemed to have been Christians. I think they were Baptist Christians, I think. And I understand that he was sort of rebellious and didn't want to have anything to do. So that's one of the reasons he emigrated to the United States. He was 19 years old, I believe. And he emigrated to the United States. And I don't know what all jobs he might have had first, but he was in Chicago, and I think he didn't have a job or didn't know exactly what to do. And he saw an awning. And of course, in those days, there's so many things done with canvas or done today with plastics and things today. Anyway, there was an awning. He thought, I bet I could do that. And so he bought a bunch of canvas and started making awnings, I think. And he was selling them, and he was going along, I guess. He was living in Chicago. It was the time of the Chicago fire. And of course, all sorts of houses burnt down. He sank his canvas and his machines, I think, too, in the river, in the Chicago River, I guess it was. And when it was over, he pulled them all out and made tents for all these people without houses. And boy, that brought in a bunch of money, I guess. Anyway, they set up then a canvas good for tents and awnings. And oh, I remember when the spare tires of cars were on the back and they were covered with canvas, and they made those. As a matter of fact, over there on the table there is a catalog. And after he became a Christian, then the catalog also had every page verses and texts and so forth, because once he became a Christian, he was all out. That was it. Anyway, he was up in Chicago, and they formed a company named Baker and Lockwood. Now, who Lockwood was, I don't know. He must have gone out very soon. The company still is in Kansas City, and it's still called Baker and Lockwood. It has another name on the end. It's not in the family. I remember when the family sold it off during the Second World War, which provided a lot of the money for some of us for a lot of things since then. Anyway, they formed Baker and Lockwood. He became a Christian, and I'm not exactly sure, all of the ins and outs of that, but he was with a partner named Murray, I believe it was, in Chicago, and they weren't getting along too well, I guess, and so they decided to split. They said, all right, one goes to Chicago, one goes to Kansas City. And Grandpa decided to come, or great-grandfather decided to come to Kansas City. So they moved to Kansas City. He chose a number of the employees there in Chicago to accompany him, not so much with their skills in making tents, but how good they would be as Sunday school teachers or singing out in open air meetings and that sort of thing. And he brought them with him. And that's exactly what he did. He started out meetings in the streets of Kansas City, and then after that he started with Donald Ross, or Donald Ross helped him at the beginning in founding the Troost Avenue Gospel Hall. And Troost Avenue Gospel Hall has been more or less the roots of a whole lot of us. My parents, my grandparents, my great-grandparents were all there. It continued on down, and later a bunch of brethren churches or assemblies all over Spruce Hill and Kansas City, Kansas, and Overland Park, now Shawnee and so forth. All the roots have all come out of there. That's where my parents grew up. That's where I grew up till I was 7 years old. That's where I was baptized. That's where my wife was baptized, because we didn't have a baptistry in Lawrence, and so forth. So Troost Avenue Gospel Hall was, and I have friends still. The Simpson family in New York, for example, I grew up with them. They're still my friends up to today, and so forth. That was really a spiritual nest, or something, I don't know what you call it, and so forth, for the entire family. Anyway, C.J. Baker became very well known. He sent tents out all over the world. I know the very first Brethren Church in Buenos Aires, Argentina, the building burnt down, and so they had to rebuild it. Where are they going to meet till they rebuild it? C.J. Baker sent them a great big tent. They did in that tent. I have this in a magazine published in Argentina saying C.J. Baker from Kansas City sent us this tent for us to use and so forth to meet in. And he sent out tents all over the world. And I mean sometimes big tents. Baker and Lockwood made all of the big circus tents. Circuses were very popular in those days, except for Ringling Brothers, Barnum and Bailey. They made their own tents. But he made all of these tremendous big tents. And everybody, my father, for example, knew exactly how all the knots and how to rope and so forth. How did he learn it? Because he worked in the Baker and Lockwood tent factory. As a matter of fact, it carried down, and I worked in the tent factory of my Uncle Harry, who was and so forth. During the Second World War, I made army tents. I was working in there when the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. I can still remember. I came home, I think it was a Wednesday. I came
told
home
that.
from...
You already said
You
that.
told that.
You already
Well,
did.
okay, well, fine. Well, so there I was. Thank you. People called to accuse me of repeating. I don't understand why.
It's okay, we all.
Maybe if
He
I
made
didn't...
revival tents.
Oh, yeah, revival tents and so forth. And I remember
And
my...
covered wagon,
Huh?
covered wagon cover.
Oh, that's, yeah, Kansas
line
City,
up
there,
with that.
Kansas City there was then they drop off to go west in covered wagons. And when he got to Kansas City, he started making all the covers for covered wagons as they set off across the plains. You know, they were really plains. My Uncle Harry told me when he was young, there was nothing paved, I think, west of Lawrence, Kansas. And he told me about all of going through the mud roads out to Hutchinson and these places to try and camp up tents. He said it was a long day's journey through all the mud. And of course, those were Model T cars too, Ford Model T cars. So, I think he probably had enough. I could go on for 3 more days.
Well, we know that.
You know that.
Here's the deal, we can ask you questions too, and we can ask you through the day and whatever. Because you
One thing
raised
I'll
a lot
mention,
of questions.
of course, from C.J. Baker come all sorts of inheritance. Half the people in this place probably have Baker in their name. Some of them is even their name.
I know.
See, there's Baker. My dad was William Baker. My brother was James Baker, which he hated all his life. Well, he did. And my dad was disappointed. He said, I thought that Jim would appreciate that. And he told me that. He said, I
You
thought
named
Jim...
the wrong kid Baker.
Huh?
You named the wrong kid Baker.
I guess he did. I guess he did. Anyway, and then the ones that aren't Baker are C.J. And there's C.J., that's Charles John. And some of them are, he was Caleb Jason. Well, his grandson then was Caleb John. That was my Uncle C.J. And then some of them are Charles John. But it's always C.J., C.J., C.J.
Caleb J.
Huh?
Marcus is. Very
Very good.
He did it on purpose.
That's good. That's good. Very good.
Why he's making the Baker leather.
Maybe getting back to settle in Sussex. Who knows? Yeah. There's one thing that the Sommerville, Baker, Aldergoff, Alsman family do have in common a great, great number, and that is the Christian faith. And I think one of the things, and I think Sonny has mentioned, or somebody mentioned, one of the things that has kept us all together is not simply that we like each other's families. I'll tell you, in the United States, this is really breaking down more than much more than in Argentina, where family is still pretty strong. But here, the kid gets 18, 19 years old, he's got to go off by himself someplace, something like that. Well, that still is not true in Argentina at all. But I think that's one thing that's kept them together, is that we all grew up with the same center, and that is the Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. And I'm very, very happy. I have all my 4 children are believers. They all married believers. The grandchildren, great-grandchildren have come along that way, and I think a lot of it is simply that family heritage. There are some that no, but I think that's one of the things that certainly has pulled us together. And so I hope we can continue in that path. Now, questions?
David?
Yes.
Turn around.
This is CJ behind
Don't
you.
make him turn around.
This is CJ. This is Caleb Jason.
Good for you.
No, Josiah.
Oh, is he Josiah? Oh, I am wrong. Oh, Josiah. Well, that's a good name.
Well, that's a good name.
That's
Now, we've got plenty of CJs around, and plenty of Bakers around, and,
Oh, Isaac Concord, Isaac Baker.
And he has Baker.
should we have everybody to CJ or Baker stand up?
Stand up if you have Baker or Caleb or whatever it is.
Baker or Caleb or CJ or, is that all? Some people are just
They're
timid.
not all
Some
here.
people are
Oh, they're
timid.
not here.
They're not here. They're not
There are a
here.
lot.
They're too young, so it really does go on generation after generation. Okay, anything else, anything you'd like to?
Well, we got a lot of first ones that are Marie.
Yeah.
You can mention that.
My mother was Marie, and she was Catherine Marie. Her mother was Catherine Marie also. Catherine Marie Meisinger was the great. But the reason for the Catherine, of course, was from Catherine the Great. Catherine the Great had brought all these Germans over, and so these people from German communities were naming their kids Catherine after Catherine the Great.
Well, what was Marie?
Well, her grandmother her grandmother in Russia was Catherine Marie Meisinger.
And all the first ones are.
By the way, I'll tell you something about the oligarch.
Michelle wants to stand up to represent the Marie.
Maurice and Kathy.
Marie.
She's a Marie.
Kathy.
Debbie is a Marie.
Here's Debbie.
Here's my cousin, Marie. Sonny Marie, where's Sonny Marie?
The first picture I have taken was Debbie at about 2 or 3 years old with Michelle lying across her lap as a baby. That's the very first picture.
Let's recreate. Mom, Michelle.
It was taken in Springfield, Missouri. Where she was laying across this way. But anyway, that's all right. Yeah.
And ours is Catherine. Our daughter is Catherine.
Catherine. That was the reason for that. Yeah. The Marie, I don't know where it came in, of course. But, I don't know how far back that. I don't know beyond on that side. I don't know beyond my grandfather's mother and father, who were, that is, oligarch and Meisinger.
David,
Yes,
I
ma'am.
want you to know that Nancy, who is not by blood your relative,
Yeah.
was taken to young people's meeting by Uncle Harry every week. And she remembers it probably more fondly almost than some of them, because she knew him better. Because he told stories. All the way and to the meeting, he would tell her stories.
Up until the time I think my dad died, a lot of the time he called me Harry. He did. Harry, his brother was a favorite of his, and he said, I love to take walks with Harry because he doesn't talk. And Uncle Harry actually was my boss. He employed me to make tents, Uncle Harry. He was a good friend. Yeah. My Uncle CJ, I had a CJ, he died very tragically in a breathing arsenic fumes in a laboratory. I remember that. I was at KU with his son Duncan. And,
Making uranium.
huh?
Making uranium.
Extracting germanium to make the very first things that they use for computers. That enabled computers to be made because they didn't have chips then. They had to have something that we used germanium. And the germanium that they got was either from Mexico, which had arsenic in it, or from Arkansas, I think, or something, and they got this shipment, and it was badly, as if it was from Arkansas, I think, it was actually from Mexico, and in the laboratory, he inhaled these fumes, and he got his assistant out and made a few notes and got out, but it was too much, and after a week he died, and it was bad. It was down in Joplin, Missouri, and I used to go down to Joplin often and visit my cousin Duncan. My cousin Duncan was closer probably to me than any of my own siblings because we grew up only 2 months difference. We went to Cordley School together in Lawrence. We went to university together. I still remember being in the same geology group. We both thought that we might be geologists. And the teacher was a fantastic, Lowell Loud, but his assistant was a very beautiful young woman, and she would sit there, you know, and so forth. So Duncan thought we'd fool her. So we always signed our papers D. Sommerville, David Sommerville, you see, and Duncan Sommerville. And somehow she always seemed to know which was which. We were both getting A's, so it wasn't the grade, but somehow she could pick us out. Anyway, that's ancient history too, but not quite so ancient because I'm still here. However, when I turned 90, I put in a newsletter, when I turned 90, I decided I was no longer old. I was ancient. And so I had passed on to being an antique. Oh, other questions? Anything else I haven't repeated 3 times? Someday I'm going to put all of this down on paper, and that way I can correct it and cut out the paragraphs you see that I've repeated already.
Make sure it's before you're 110.
Well, okay. I'll try. I'm better shape, I think, this time than I came up in December of last year, so never say never again, says James Bond and David Sommerville.
Whoa!
It's about the only thing I have in common with James Bond.
Thank you, David. Thank you so much.